Barbara Hutton's story is well documented, multiple biographies, contemporary press coverage, court estate records, strong sections, her inheritance size, the Woolworth empire's rise, her 7 marriages and their costs, her spending patterns, her declining net worth over decades, her death circumstances, thinner, softer areas, precise dollar figures on some individual gifts to husbands, widely reported, but with some verse sources. I'll use close to language, and some anecdotes that are frequently repeated in pop history, retellings but not independently sourced. I'll avoid those or flag them as generic. I won't invent quotes or specific dialogue. Hook approach chosen. B. Reversal. Open with her impoverished, lonely death, then rewind to reveal she was once the richest girl on earth. This is the strongest hook because the gap between richest girl in the world died with almost nothing alone is more shocking than a straightforward paradox opener, and it pays off the cliffhanger from the postscript perfectly. Architected verified narrative framework with contrasting wealthy families. Architected verified narrative framework with contrasting wealthy families. Barbara Hutton, the richest girl in the world with $3,500. Hook. In a hotel room in Beverly Hills, in May of 1979, a woman died of a heart attack at the age of 66. Her bank balance came to around $3,500. 16 people came to her funeral. That number is almost an insult when you know who she was, because at her peak, this woman controlled a fortune worth $900 million in today's money. She was once called, without exaggeration, the richest girl in the world. So how does the richest girl in the world end up with less cash in her account than most people carry in a checking account today? Her name was Barbara Hutton, and her story is the fastest, most complete vanishing act a great American fortune has ever pulled off. The rise. To understand how big this fortune was, you have to go back to a 5-and-dime store in Utica, New York, and a man named Frank Winfield Woolworth. In the 1880s, Woolworth had a simple, almost stubborn idea. Sell ordinary household goods at fixed, rock-bottom prices, 5 cents and 10 cents, no haggling, no exceptions. It sounded too plain to work. It worked spectacularly. By the early 1900s, Woolworth's 5-and-dime stores had spread across the country, and by 1913 the company was so wealthy that Frank Woolworth paid for the construction of the Woolworth Building in Manhattan entirely in cash, no mortgage, briefly the tallest building in the world. That single building was a monument to how much cash a chain of nickel stores could generate when it was run right. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was Frank Woolworth's granddaughter, born in New York City in November 1912. Her mother, Edna Woolworth, was Frank's daughter. Her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, was co-founder of the Wall Street investment firm E.F. Hutton, so Barbara was, from birth, sitting at the intersection of 2 enormous American fortunes, retail on one side, finance on the other, and she was, by marriage, tied to a third. Her aunt was Marjorie Merriweather Post, the General Foods heiress, which made her, remarkably, first cousins with the actress Dina Merrill. Cruising the past. But Barbara's childhood was not gilded so much as it was hollow. When she was young, her mother died, and the loss shaped the rest of her life. Her father, absorbed in business and largely absent, left her to be raised by relatives and staff. Money arrived early and constantly. Attention did not. By the time she turned 21 in 1933, the inheritance came due, and it was staggering. Sources place it around $50 million, some closer to $40 million. funneled to her from the Woolworth fortune. In the money of 2026, that is somewhere close to $900 million to $1 billion. Barbara Hutton, quite literally one of the richest people on the planet, and she was 21 years old. Celebrity net worth. The press had a name for her before she'd done a single thing to earn it. They called her the poor little rich girl, a nickname that started it at her lavish, expensive debutante ball in 1930, staged in the middle of the Great Depression while breadlines stretched around city blocks. It was a strange, uncomfortable image, a teenage heiress dancing in silk while the country queued for soup. That contrast would follow her for the rest of her life. Lipstick Alley. The monuments. Here is where Barbara's story splits sharply from the pattern you might expect. Marjorie Post built palaces. William Cecil built wineries. Barbara Hutton built neither. Her monuments were not buildings you could tour. They were marriages. She married 7 times. 7. Each one was its own kind of expensive stage set. She married minor European royalty and titled aristocrats. A Georgian prince, a Danish count, a Russian prince, a Dominican diplomat, a German baron, a Vietnamese prince. In between, for a brief and famous stretch in the 1940s, she married Cary Grant, the one husband who is remembered, notably, as walking away with nothing. The press dubbed that pairing Cash and Cary, a joke about the money flowing one direction, though in that particular marriage it mostly didn't. The other 6 marriages tell a different story. This was an era, and a set of men, where marrying an heiress was itself a kind of career. Barbara's own butler warned her, when she was still a child, that being called the richest girl in the world simply meant men would want to marry her for the money. He turned out to be right almost every time. Each husband, after living lavishly on her fortune during the marriage, walked away afterward with a substantial piece of it. Titles were purchased in the process, sometimes literally, through gifts and settlements to the families of the men she married. Palaces were rented and furnished. Jewels were bought to match the occasion, and when each marriage collapsed, the settlements went out the door along with the ring. 'Cause it wasn't only the husbands. Barbara spent with the same restless energy on everything around her. She bought grand homes in London, Tangier, Palm Beach, Cuernavaca, and Pacific Palisades, each one staffed and stocked at a scale built for entertaining royalty. She collected art and antiques with real connoisseurship, pieces once owned by Marie Antoinette and Empress Eugénie of France. And she chased extraordinary jewelry, most famously a rare 40-carat diamond that she had recut down to 36 carats, simply because she preferred the shape. Social Life magazine +2. None of this was a mansion sitting empty on a hillside, costing $1 million a year in upkeep, the way Mar-a-Lago drained Marjorie Post. This was something faster and, in its way, more efficient. Barbara Hutton did not build white elephants. She married them, divorced them, and paid them on the way out the door. 6 settlements. 6 households furnished and dissolved. Dozens of estates purchased and abandoned. Each one a smaller version of the same event. Money converted into something that gave nothing back. Mechanism. Here is the quiet arithmetic underneath all of it. The same principle that sank Marjorie Post's palaces, just moving at a different speed. A fortune only survives if it is put to work, if it sits inside something that generates more than it costs. The moment you convert capital into pure consumption, a house that earns no rent, a diamond that pays no dividend, a settlement paid to a departing husband, that money is gone from the machine forever. It doesn't come back around. It doesn't compound. It leaves. Marjorie Post converted her fortune into stone and marble, monuments that stood still and cost money every single year to maintain. Barbara Hutton converted hers into something that moved even faster, into relationships that were, in financial terms, one-way transactions. A palace at least still exists after the money is spent. A divorce settlement simply evaporates. Marjorie's mistake played out over decades. Barbara's played out across a single adult lifetime, marriage after marriage, each one another slice removed from a fortune that was never being replenished by anything. And that is the piece missing from Barbara's story that was missing from Marjorie's too. There was no machine. Barbara never ran a business. She never sat on the Woolworth Company's board in any meaningful operating capacity. She held stock and she spent income, but she was never inside the engine that made the money in the first place. She inherited a river, and she treated it like a well that could never run dry. Ask yourself, if $50 million in 1933 money, run through 7 marriages, dozens of homes, and half a century of extravagant living, what would be left? The honest answer is very little. And that is almost exactly what happened. The fall. By the time Barbara Hutton reached her 60s, the woman once called the richest girl in the world was, by most accounts, functionally broke. She spent her final years living not in a mansion, but in a hotel room, at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, a rented suite standing in for the palaces she'd once owned outright. Her health had declined for years, worn down by decades of hard living. On May 11, 1979, she died there of a heart attack at 66 years old. Heiress Financial Group. Only 16 mourners attended her funeral. Compare that, for a moment, to the debutante ball 3 decades earlier, the one thrown in the teeth of the Great Depression, a party so extravagant it made headlines around the world. The woman who once couldn't walk into a room without being the center of global attention was buried in front of 16 people. Heiress Financial Group. And the number that closes out her financial story is almost too clean to be believable. At the time of her death, Barbara Hutton's net worth stood at $5,500, not $3.5 million, $35. A fortune that had once been worth something close to $900 million in today's money had been run down, over roughly 46 years, to less than the price of a used car. Some biographers and people who knew her personally have pushed back on that exact figure, suggesting she wasn't quite as destitute as the number implies. But even by the most generous accounts, what remained bore no resemblance to what she'd inherited. The fortune dented. It was gone. Celebrity net worth. Outron. There's a bitter footnote sitting alongside all of this. The Woolworth Company itself, the retail empire her grandfather built, didn't survive much longer either. Competition from newer discount chains eroded its business for decades, and the company that once built the tallest building in the world for cash eventually shrank down to a handful of stores and closed for good in 1997. Barbara didn't cause that. She had no operating role in the company by then. But it's a strange kind of symmetry that both the fortune and the business that created it ran out within 20 years of each other, as if the entire Woolworth story, from nickel stores to a penniless heiress, closed its own loop. Cruising the past. The contrast. Now hold Barbara Hutton's story up against a very different heiress problem, one that got solved instead of ignored. Look at the Mars family, the candy company behind M&M's and Snickers. Mars has produced billionaires across multiple generations, And it has done it by refusing to do the one thing Barbara's family never managed. It kept the company entirely private, entirely family-owned, run by family members who actually worked inside the business, rather than living purely off dividends spun out to be spent. The wealth stayed tied to an operating company that kept making candy and kept making money, generation after generation, instead of being liquidated into consumption. Or look at the Cargill and Macmillan families, who have controlled the massive agricultural trading company Cargill since the 1800s. Like Mars, Cargill has stayed private for well over a century, spread across more than 1,000 descendants today, and it has done that by keeping ownership tied to the operating business, rather than paying heirs out in cash they could spend down to nothing. The family fortune isn't a static pile of money sitting in an account waiting to be drained by bad marriages or bad houses. It's locked inside a company that has to keep performing to justify its own existence. That's the difference in one sentence. Mars and Cargill kept their heirs inside the machine. Barbara Hutton was handed a check and sent out the door alone, with no business to run, no operating role to hold her accountable to anything, and a piece of advice from her own butler warning her, correctly, that the money itself would attract exactly the kind of people who would help her lose it. The lesson. Here is the lesson underneath Barbara Hutton's entire life, and it is a harder one than Marjorie posts, because it isn't really about buildings. A fortune handed to someone with nothing to do but spend it does not survive contact with a lifetime. It doesn't matter whether the money goes into limestone palaces or into wedding rings and settlements. Consumption is consumption. The only fortunes that last are the ones tied to something that has to keep earning, a business, a trust with real teeth, a role that comes with responsibility attached. Give a person money with no machine underneath it, and you haven't given them security. You've given them countdown clock. The back. Picture that hotel room again, in May of 1979. A woman who was once the most talked about heiress on earth, who was dressed by the finest houses in Paris, who married princes and counts and one movie star, dying alone with $500 to her name, and 16 people at her funeral. The nickname the press gave her as a teenager turned out to be more accurate than anyone could have guessed at the time. She really was, in the end, exactly what they called her at 19 years old. The poor, rich girl. The fanger. But Barbara Hutton at least inherited a fortune that was already built for her, and lost it slowly over the better part of half a century. What happens when a fortune is lost almost overnight, not through slow decay, but through a single, catastrophic bet? There's a story of an American dynasty that did exactly that, a family name that was once a byword for old money, and a decision made in a matter of months that erased generations of wealth almost in one motion. That story is next.